The first reports didn't come from the battlefield. They came from screens. Oil terminals flickered with warning alerts. Radar operators watched fast-moving signals crawl across black digital maps. And somewhere above the Persian Gulf, aircraft cut through the night, unseen, unheard, until it was too late. Then the explosions began. Not one, not isolated, but coordinated, precise strikes, unfolding almost simultaneously across a region that powers the global economy. Within minutes, shipping routes slowed, insurance markets froze, and traders, half a world away, started pulling back before they even understood what they were watching. This wasn't just an attack. It was a shockwave. In Tehran, sirens cut through the dark. In Tel Aviv, command rooms lit up with confirmation reports. And in Washington, phones started ringing faster than anyone could answer them, because this was the moment everything shifted, not gradually, not politically, but instantly. A conflict that had simmered in shadows, through proxies, covert strikes, and quiet escalation, had now broken into the open. And with it came a question no one could ignore. Was this the beginning of something decisive, or the start of something uncontrollable? At first glance, the answer seemed obvious. The strikes were effective. Targets were hit. High-value infrastructure was damaged, and the message was clear. This was strength, precision, control. But war has a way of disguising its consequences in the opening moments, because what looks like dominance can sometimes be the beginning of exposure. As the night continued, more reports followed, missiles launched in response, drones detected over key commercial hubs, and most critically, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow artery through which nearly a fifth of the world's oil flows, began to feel the pressure, not closed, not yet, but threatened. And in global markets, that distinction barely mattered. Prices surged, confidence dropped. And suddenly, a regional conflict was no longer regional. It was global. Leaders moved quickly to frame the moment. Some called it necessary, others called it inevitable. But behind closed doors, the conversations were far less certain, because even as the first wave of strikes ended, no one could answer the one question that mattered most. What happens next? There was no clear end state, no obvious path to victory, only a rapidly expanding chain of consequences. And somewhere inside that uncertainty, the balance of power was already beginning to change, not just between nations, but within them. Because while missiles lit up the night sky, something quieter was taking shape beneath it all, a shift in perception, a shift in control. And by morning, it would become clear. This war wasn't going to reshape just one country. It was going to reshape all of them. What looked like strength was about to expose something far more fragile. By sunrise, the story had already begun to change, not on the battlefield, but in the way it was being understood. Inside Israel, the strikes were not seen as escalation. They were seen as confirmation. For months, pressure had been building. Questions over leadership, divisions over Gaza, protests that refused to disappear. The political ground had been shifting, slowly but unmistakably. And then, overnight, it stopped. Because the focus moved away from internal conflict, away from political fracture, and toward something far more unifying. Iran. A threat that, in the Israeli mindset, didn't divide opinion. It erased it. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about policy failures or domestic unrest. It was about survival, security, deterrence, strength. And in that environment, the rules of politics change. Criticism softens, opposition quiets, and leadership, especially leadership built on security, regains its footing. Benjamin Netanyahu understood this terrain better than most. For years, he had framed Iran not just as a rival, but as an existential danger, a force that, if left unchecked, would reshape the region against Israel's interests. Now, that argument no longer needed explanation. The war had made it self-evident. Every strike reinforced it. Every retaliation justified it. And with each passing hour, something subtle but powerful was taking place. The political map was being redrawn. Not through elections, not through speeches, but through perception. Because in times of crisis, clarity often replaces complexity. And Iran provided that clarity. It unified factions that had been at odds. It simplified narratives that had grown messy. It turned political debate into national consensus. Even those who opposed Netanyahu found themselves pulled into the same gravity. Because this was no longer about him, it was about the threat. And in that shift, his position strengthened, not necessarily in polling. Numbers, not yet, but in something more immediate. Authority, relevance, control over the narrative. The war had done what months of politics could not. It had changed the subject. But there was a deeper layer to it, because wars don't just elevate leaders, they test them. And the expectations now were higher than ever. This wasn't a limited operation. It wasn't symbolic. It had been framed, implicitly and explicitly, as something larger, a decisive move, a step toward weakening or even reshaping Iran's influence across the region. And that created a new kind of pressure, because once a war is defined in those terms, anything less than a clear outcome begins to look like failure. For now, the momentum was on Netanyahu's side. The narrative was aligned, the public mood was focused, and the sense of purpose was clear. But war doesn't stay contained within one perspective, because at the exact same moment that this conflict was consolidating power in one country, it was doing the opposite in another. And for the man in the White House, this war wasn't simplifying anything. It was closing in. In Washington, the same war looked very different. There were no scenes of unity, no sudden clarity, only pressure. It built quietly at first, inside briefing rooms, across intelligence reports, in conversations that stretched late into the night. Because the expectations going into this war had been very different. It wasn't supposed to unfold like this. The assumption had been simple. Apply overwhelming pressure, force a response, and push Iran toward submission, a familiar pattern, one that had worked, at least in theory, elsewhere. But Iran didn't respond the way it was expected to. It didn't collapse inward. It didn't rush toward negotiation. Instead, it absorbed the derb and pushed back, measured, controlled, defiant. Not chaotic retaliation, but calculated resistance. And that changed everything. Because now the United States wasn't managing a short confrontation. It was inside an open-ended conflict, one without a clear timeline, one without a clear objective, and most dangerously, one without a clear way out. Inside the White House, the choices narrowed quickly. There were only three paths forward. The first, continue. Sustain the strikes, maintain pressure, hope the time would eventually break Iran's position. But time cuts both ways. The longer the conflict lasted, the greater the risk of escalation, the higher the cost, economically, politically, globally. The second, declare victory. Frame the operation as a success, step back, and hope Iran chose not to respond further. But hope is not strategy. And if Tehran continued to push, that narrative would collapse almost instantly. The third option, escalate, not incrementally, but decisively. Expand the conflict, increase the stakes, force a conclusion. But escalation carries its own gravity. Once you move past a certain point, you don't control where it ends. And that was the dilemma. Every option carried risk. Every path led deeper into uncertainty. There was no clean resolution, no moment that could be clearly defined as victory. Only trade-offs and consequences. Because while the United States was weighing these decisions, the effects of the war were already spreading beyond it. Missiles weren't just crossing battle lines anymore. They were crossing economies. Energy markets reacted instantly. Shipping routes adjusted in real time. Allies, especially in the Gulf, found themselves exposed in ways they hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just a military situation, it was systemic. And the longer it continued, the harder it became to contain. For President Trump, the war had become something else entirely. Not a demonstration of strength, but a test of limits, strategic limits, economic limits, political limits, and unlike a conventional battlefield, there was no clear line marking where those limits lay. Only the growing sense that they were being approached, because this wasn't a conflict you could simply win and walk away from. And as the days passed, one reality became harder to ignore. The war wasn't narrowing, it was expanding, and with every new strike, every new response, it pulled more actors into its orbit, more risks, more consequences, until eventually the question was no longer how to win, but how to stop something that no longer wanted to stop. By the second phase of the war, the battlefield had already outgrown its borders. There was no single front line, no clear edge where the fighting began or ended. Instead, it stretched across airspace, across sea lanes, across invisible lines of influence that had existed long before the first strike. And at the center of it all, two parallel wars were unfolding. Israel moved with precision. Its focus was clear: western and northern Iran, ballistic missile sites, nuclear infrastructure, command networks, targets that defined capability. And then, something more deliberate: leadership. Senior figures, those responsible for security, intelligence, coordination, were no longer distant names on a hierarchy. They became targets. One by one, they were located, tracked, removed. It was a strategy designed not just to weaken Iran, but to disorient it, to fracture decision-making, to slow response, to create gaps where coordination once existed. And in those early days, it worked. Strikes landed with accuracy. Operations unfolded with confidence. The tempo stayed high. From a purely tactical perspective, the results were undeniable. But wars are not measured in isolated successes, because at the same time, on a different axis, the United States was fighting a very different kind of battle. Not over cities, but over flow. In the east and south, attention turned to the Sea, the Strait of Hormuz. A narrow stretch of water, geographically small, strategically enormous. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil passes through it, and now it had become part of the war. American operations focused on limiting Iran's ability to control that space. Naval assets repositioned, surveillance intensified, strikes targeted maritime capabilities. This wasn't about territory, it was about pressure, keeping shipping lanes open, preventing disruption, maintaining a fragile sense of stability in a region that was anything but stable. Two wars, one targeting the structure of a state, the other trying to preserve the system around it, and for a moment it seemed coordinated, aligned. But beneath that alignment, a deeper tension was forming. Because success in both arenas carried an unexpected consequence, it raised the stakes. Every successful strike inside Iran increased the pressure to respond. Every disruption in maritime space increased the global cost of escalation. And Iran was watching both, carefully. Because it didn't need to win every exchange, it only needed to ensure that the cost of continuing kept rising. And so, the pattern began to shift. Retaliation didn't come as a single overwhelming wave. It came in layers. Missiles launched not just at military targets, but toward areas that carried economic weight. Drones probing defenses, not always to destroy, but to test, to map reactions, to expose vulnerabilities. And slowly the war expanded again, not geographically, but functionally. Because now it wasn't just about degrading capability, it was about signaling. Every strike carried a message. Every response adjusted the balance. And with each exchange, something became clearer. The battlefield wasn't fixed. It was fluid, shifting between land and sea, between military and economic targets, between immediate gains and long-term consequences. And that made control almost impossible. Because the more effective each side became, the more unpredictable the outcome grew. What looked like momentum was beginning to blur into something else, something harder to define. Because the war was no longer being fought in one place. It was being fought everywhere that mattered. And the more it spread, the harder it became to contain. Far from the launch sites, far from the command rooms, another reality was taking shape. Quieter, less visible, but far more vulnerable. In the Gulf, there were no illusions about distance, because geography here offers no protection. Oil terminals sit exposed along the coastline, shipping lanes narrow into choke points, and entire economies depend on a constant, uninterrupted flow of energy. For decades, that system had been built on one assumption, that stability, however fragile, would hold. Now, that assumption was breaking, not all at once, but piece by piece. The first signs weren't explosions. They were interruptions. Shipping companies began rerouting vessels. Insurance costs surged overnight. Ports slowed operations, not because they were destroyed, but because they were no longer certain they were safe. And in global markets, uncertainty is enough, because when risk rises, movement stops. And when movement stops, so does the system. The Strait of Hormuz became the focal point, a narrow corridor of water just wide enough to sustain global demand, and just vulnerable enough to disrupt it entirely. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil passes through it, not eventually, not gradually, every single day. And now it was under pressure. Iran didn't need to close it, it only needed to make it feel unsafe. Missiles didn't have to land directly on tankers, drones didn't have to destroy infrastructure, they only had to exist. Visible, possible, unpredictable. Because the threat alone was enough to ripple outward. Energy prices reacted instantly. Currencies shifted. Governments recalculated. And in the Gulf states, the realization set in quickly. This war was not contained. It was sitting at their doorstep. For years, these nations had balanced carefully, maintaining alliances with Washington, managing tensions with Tehran, building economic futures that depended on openness, stability, and growth. Now, those calculations were collapsing, because the conflict they hadn't chosen was being fought across the systems they depended on most. Airspace became uncertain, energy facilities became targets, directly or indirectly, and the cost of neutrality began to rise. Every escalation forced a decision: align more closely, or risk standing exposed. And neither option was safe, because alignment brought visibility, and visibility brought risk. This was the paradox of the Gulf. The more important the region became to global stability, the more vulnerable it became to disruption. And the war understood that. Good. Strikes and counterstrikes began to orbit these economic centers, not always hitting them, but always reminding them that they were within reach, that their stability was conditional, that their future, once seen as the region's most secure, was now tied to a conflict they did not control. Analysts would later describe it in simple terms. The biggest losers were not the ones launching the strikes, they were the ones absorbing the consequences. Because while military power determined the pace of the war, economic exposure determined its cost. And in the Gulf, that cost was rising by the hour. Not in headlines, not always in visible damage, but in something harder to measure: confidence. The belief that the system would hold, that trade would continue, that stability could be maintained. Once that belief starts to crack, everything built on top of it begins to shift. And that is what made this phase of the war so dangerous. Not the scale of destruction, but the scale of uncertainty. Because uncertainty spreads faster than missiles. It crosses borders without resistance. It reaches markets before governments can respond. And once it takes hold, it is almost impossible to contain. By now, the battlefield had expanded beyond recognition. It was no longer just about military objectives. It was about systems, economies, alliances, and in that expanding conflict, the Gulf was no longer watching from the sidelines. It was part of the war, whether it wanted to be or not. On paper, the alliance was solid. The United States and Israel, strategically aligned, militarily coordinated, politically intertwined. Daily calls, shared intelligence, joint operations unfolding across the same battlefield. From the outside, it looked unified. But wars have a way of exposing the spaces between alignment and agreement, because even as both countries pursued the same enemy, they were not fighting the same war. For Israel, the calculation was existential. Iran wasn't just a rival state. It was a long-term threat, one that operated through proxies, surrounded borders, and challenged survival itself. From that perspective, instability inside Iran wasn't necessarily a risk. It was an outcome, something that could weaken the system, disrupt coordination, reduce long-term danger. But in Washington, the calculation was different. Instability wasn't a tool, it was a liability. Because the United States wasn't just managing a conflict with Iran, it was managing a global system. Trade routes, energy markets, alliances that stretched far beyond the immediate battlefield. And in that system, instability spreads. It doesn't stay contained within one country. It moves outward, into economies, into diplomacy, into regions that depend on balance. This was the divide, not in objectives, but in tolerance. How much chaos is acceptable in pursuit of security? And the answer wasn't the same. The difference became visible in moments that weren't supposed to happen. An Israeli strike on Iran's South Pars gas field, one of the largest energy sites in the world, shared with Qatar, triggered immediate shockwaves not just in Tehran, but in Washington. Because Qatar wasn't just another country in the region, it was an ally, a partner in energy, a node in the global system the United States was trying to protect. And suddenly, that system had been touched. Publicly, the response was swift. The United States distanced itself. Statements emphasized lack of foreknowledge, no direct involvement, a clear signal this was not coordinated. But the damage wasn't just in the strike itself. It was in what it revealed, that even within a close alliance, actions could diverge, that coordination had limits, and that in a war like this, those limits matter. Because every independent move carries consequences beyond its immediate target. It affects trust, perception, the fragile balance that alliances depend on. Behind closed doors, those questions grew sharper. Was the strategy fully aligned? Were the risks being calculated the same way? Or were two partners moving along parallel paths that only appeared connected? At the surface, nothing had changed. The alliance held. Operations continued. Communication remained constant. But beneath it, something more subtle had shifted. A recognition that even allies in the same war can see the outcome very differently. And in a conflict where escalation is always one step away, those differences aren't just political. They are dangerous. By now, one reality had become unavoidable. This war was not spiraling out of control. It was being carefully controlled, just not in the way anyone had expected. In Tehran, the response was deliberate. There was no rush toward total escalation, no overwhelming retaliation designed to end the conflict in a single blow. Instead, precision, measured strikes, calibrated responses, each move designed not to win immediately, but to reshape the cost of continuing. Because Iran didn't need a decisive victory. It needed endurance. It needed to prove that it could absorb pressure and still respond, that it could survive the initial derb and make every next step more expensive than the last. Missiles were launched, but not indiscriminately. Targets were chosen with intent, economic nodes, strategic signals, moments that forced reaction without triggering total collapse. This wasn't chaos, it was strategy. A slow tightening of pressure, because every response carried a message. You can continue this war, but it will cost you more each time. And that message was working. In Washington, the options were narrowing further. Each new strike required a response. Each response risked escalation. And with every cycle, the threshold for stopping grew higher. Because wars like this create their own gravity. Once engaged, stepping back begins to look like weakness. Pausing becomes politically difficult. De-escalation becomes harder to justify. And so the cycle continues. Not because it is the best option, but because it becomes the only remaining one. This was the trap. Not a sudden escalation, but a gradual loss of flexibility, the kind that happens slowly until it's too late to reverse. Iran understood this dynamic. Its strategy wasn't built around winning the war outright. It was built around shaping the outcome, raising the cost high enough that any resolution would come with conditions, sanctions relief, strategic concessions, a repositioning of power, not through victory on the battlefield, but through pressure over time. And that left the United States in a difficult position, because the longer the war continued, the more leverage shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but incrementally. With each exchange, the question changed from, how do we win this? To, what are we willing to accept to end it? And once that question takes hold, the nature of the war changes completely. It's no longer about dominance, it's about limits. How far can you go before the cost outweighs the objective? How much pressure can you apply before the system begins to strain? And most importantly, at what point does continuing become more dangerous than stopping? By this stage, there were no easy answers left, only trade-offs, only consequences, because the war had reached a point where every option carried risk, and none offered resolution. It was no longer about choosing the best path forward. It was about choosing which cost to accept. And that is the moment when a war becomes something else entirely. Not a strategy, not a plan, but a problem with no clear solution, a war with no off-ramp. By the final phase of the war, the battlefield had settled into something deceptive, not peace, not resolution, but perception. And in that perception, one leader appeared stronger than before. In Israel, the shift was undeniable. The political noise that once surrounded Benjamin Netanyahu had quieted, not disappeared, but pushed to the edges. Because the war had done something few political strategies ever achieve. It had unified the narrative. The focus was no longer fragmented between internal divisions, protests, or policy debates. It had narrowed, sharply, onto a single axis, security. And in that space, Netanyahu was at his strongest. For years, he had framed Iran as the central threat, not one among many, but the one that mattered most. A long-term danger, a force shaping the region through proxies, influence, and deterrence. Now, that framing had become reality. The war had validated it. Every strike reinforced the idea that this was not optional, not political, but necessary. And that shifted how leadership was judged. Not by domestic policy, not by internal divisions, but by the ability to act decisively, to project strength, to take control of an uncertain situation. And in those early stages, that perception held. Israel had demonstrated reach, precision, capability. Senior Iranian figures had been eliminated. Critical infrastructure had been hit. From the outside, it looked like momentum. From the inside, it felt like control. And in politics, perception often moves faster than reality. Because even without a final outcome, early success creates its own narrative, a narrative of competence, of direction, of leadership under pressure. For Netanyahu, that narrative was powerful. It reshaped the political landscape in real time. Not necessarily in numbers. Polls remained uncertain, elections still unpredictable. But in something more immediate, authority. The ability to define the moment, to set the tone, to lead without constant internal resistance. But strength in war is rarely permanent, because the same narrative that elevates a leader also binds them to its outcome. And that outcome was still unclear. The war had been framed, implicitly and explicitly, as something larger than a limited operation, a step toward weakening Iran's influence, perhaps even reshaping it entirely. And that kind of framing comes with a cost, because once expectations are raised to that level, anything less begins to look incomplete, even failure. For now, the image held: a stronger leader, a unified narrative, a country focused outward instead of inward. But beneath that surface, a quieter question was beginning to form. What happens if the war doesn't end the way it was promised? Because strength built on momentum can shift just as quickly, and what appears solid in the middle of a conflict can become fragile by its end. At first glance, everything seemed to be holding. Markets remained steady. Confidence, at least on the surface, hadn't collapsed. In Israel, the stock exchange showed resilience. The currency held its ground. From the outside, it suggested something powerful, stability, even in the middle of war. But markets don't measure reality. They measure expectation. And in this case, that expectation was built on something fragile. Because beneath the surface, the outcome of the war was still unresolved. The strikes had been effective. The early momentum was real. But momentum is not an ending. And the entire narrative, political, strategic, psychological, was resting on a single assumption: that the war would achieve something definitive, that Iran would be weakened to the point where its influence could no longer shape the region, that the system holding it together would break. But what if it didn't? That was the risk no one could fully account for, because Iran, despite the Derb, remained intact. Its leadership structure damaged but functioning, its ability to respond reduced but not removed, its network of influence pressured but still present, and if that system endured, the meaning of the war would begin to change. Not immediately, but gradually, because the narrative would shift from decisive action to incomplete results, from strength to overreach. The same strikes that once symbolized control could start to look like escalation without resolution. And in politics, perception does not stay fixed, it evolves, especially when expectations are not met. For Netanyahu, that shift carried consequences. Because the war had been framed as more than a response, it had been presented as a path toward something larger, a transformation of the regional balance, and if that transformation failed to materialize, the question would return. Not about Iran, but about leadership, about judgment, about whether the cost of the war had matched its outcome, and beyond Israel, the risks extended even further. Because unfinished war doesn't reset the system, it reactivates it. Hamas, Hezbollah. For years, these networks had defined the rhythm of conflict, and while they had been weakened, they had not disappeared. If Iran's system survived, those connections could re-emerge, rebuild, reposition, and suddenly the region would not be facing a resolved conflict, but a delayed one that returns under different conditions, with new calculations and fewer illusions. This was the hidden fragility, not visible in markets, not immediate in headlines, but embedded in the outcome itself, because wars are not judged by how they begin, or even by how they unfold. They are judged by what they leave behind. And in this case, what remained was uncertain. A system weakened, but not broken. A leader strengthened, but tied to an unfinished result. A region shifted, but not stabilized. And that combination creates something dangerous, because it replaces clarity with ambiguity, victory with question marks, and momentum with doubt. By now, the war had revealed its deepest truth, that what appears stable in the moment can be the most fragile of all. In the end, the war did not deliver a clean answer. There was no moment of finality, no clear line between victory and defeat.